Okay, a little bit more about the quest for the historical Jesus. Abba lays out four reasons for theology to investigate the historical Jesus. We brought up earlier, is this a worthwhile endeavor? Some theologians think too much time is spent on it. Others think that it's crucial. I can say my personal opinion is I don't think the historical Jesus in any way can replace the living experience of Christ in the church. Uh, However, the experience of Christ is rooted in this tradition, right? The church does pass on the faith of the apostles. And a key element of that faith is that God actually became man. So the historicity of Jesus, of the historical um, person, Jesus of Nazareth, Yahshua ben Yosef, something like he would have been called in his own time, um, is important. Okay, so four reasons for theology investigating this according to Abel. One, that's kind of what I'm talking about. Christianity makes historical claims. Like we do say that, God actually became man and he revealed himself to us fully in the person, Jesus of Nazareth, a human person, right? We believe he was fully human and fully divine. So we should find correspondence with that when we apply reason to our historical evidence. Also, it's a way to talk about Jesus with non-Christians. Like, even if someone is not interested in faith in Jesus Christ or following Christ, as we'd say, um, you can talk about. It's a way to dialogue and open up lines of communication with people um, who are not believers, so to speak. Um, Also, and this is an important one, a deeper understanding of Jesus' humanity. Again, a little personal note here. I think this is one of the issues that Christianity faces today. That instead of saying um, Jesus lived this life and we can live it too, which I figure was the point of God becoming man, to show us that we could live like God as a human being, right? We really can cooperate with God's will. We really can learn to love unconditionally like Jesus did. Uh, Too often Christians are ready to say, well, that was Jesus. I'll just pray, pay, and obey. I'll sing songs about how much I love him. I'll go to church and praise him, and then he'll be the good one. And I'll just ride in as a member of his team, so to speak. Uh, yeah, that's, I think, kind of waters down Christianity and actually just kind of gives people an excuse not to participate in it as Christ's body. Anyways, this deeper understanding of Jesus' humanity, I think, might help us with that. He really was. I mean, we believe that he was fully human, right? And then finally, to check for fundamental discrepancies. If we're using the historical method and we find something that disagrees, that is different or more like opposed to what we believe, that's something we're going to have to deal with. I mean, as Catholics, we believe that God created the world and that the world that we live in is a sign, an expression of his um, love for us. So what happens, what we believe about Jesus using reason and the tools we have to understand the historical situation, that the discoveries that we make shouldn't contradict the faith, right? And that's because, again, we do make historical claims. Our beliefs should be in keeping with the actual history. So let's talk about the historical context of Jesus. You may notice that in every culture, Jesus is presented to look like someone from that culture, right? So here we have different icons and religious paintings of Jesus. Now, what do we know about Jesus technically? He was a Middle Eastern Jew, right? But our picture here, the Warner Jesus, painted by Warner Solomon in 1940. This is the Jesus that my grandma had hanging in her living room, right? And this is very famous. Now, I mean, this one, if you want to get historical, is not that bad. He at least has brown eyes, but you can see he looks very European, you know, opposed to this guy, the blue-eyed Jesus, right? We get that a lot. But again, I think this is an Ethiopian icon, predicting Jesus with a kind of northern African skin tone, right? And we also have, here's a Jesus. I think this is Japanese painting. And we have more. We continue to have these appropriations, right? So, again, the important thing here, just to talk about this religious art a little, is that we understand Jesus as it was a human being. That's what's important, that he became man. So it is somewhat appropriate for an image that will help the people of any given culture to identify with this. I heard a great story on the radio about it was a man telling the story, but he was telling about when he was in the first or second grade or something, that he went to Catholic school and he was African American, and all the crucifixes in every classroom were very light skinned, like European Jesus, right? And he said one day during class, the principal, who was a religious sister, right? We might call them nuns, but technically the religious sisters aren't nuns. But anyways, the sister came in and she changed the Jesus, right? She changed the crucifix, and she put a crucifix with dark skin, right? Like black Jesus, right? And she did this during class, right? She was making a point for the kids to see her do this. And this man said that that was the moment that he actually got it, that Jesus was a human being like him, right? So again, this is appropriate culturally. But if we're going to get historical about it, what would Jesus really look like? Well, not like the Warner Jesus, but like a Middle Eastern Jew. So this guy, Richard Nev, he actually took like forensic evidence. So he actually looked at the bone structure of Palestinian Jews, right, from around, the first century, the time of Jesus. And this was like what he would say with the average Jew, so to speak, living in Galilee or Judea would look like, right? So again, it's more of a historical approach here. If you're really going to see, hey, what did Jesus look like? If you want to have a historically accurate artwork of Jesus, you would want him to look like a Jew from Galilee in the first century. So what's Galilee? What are we talking about? Well, this is the basic area. Look at Palestine here. Is what the Romans called it. All right. So the Romans had taken over this area. They controlled it and taxed the Jews heavily. We'll get to that in a minute. But this area of Galilee was actually where Jesus was from. Now, to understand this, you have to go back about 500 years earlier when the Jews were exiled into Babylon, which would be over here someplace. All right. So they were there for about 50 years in exile, and then they were allowed to come back, all right, and resettle Judah. This was a political move by the Persian king at that time. And so when they did this, a lot of them came back to Jerusalem here in southern Judah, right, and kind of rebuilt that city and resettled there. And this area then was called Judea, right, or land of the Jews, by the Romans when they conquered it. But other ones of them came back here and settled a little bit more north in Galilee, which was kind of a place where you could do fishing here, and it was more friendly towards farming because you have the hills up here you can see. So some of the Jews who came back from the Babylonian exile in around 527 BC, they settled up here. And this is where Jesus was part of this group. Now, this group of Judea, the Judean Jews, they consider these people kind of to be Hicks. There's a passage in the Bible where it said that nothing good comes from Galilee, right? Kind of a paraphrase there, but that's the gist of it. And so Jesus and the apostles, then when they came down here, well, there's apostles that were Galilean, which the first few were. They, they were kind of seen as country bumpkins, to use a impolite term there. All right. Now, this other area, Samaria, was very interesting too, because this area also had people who were the descendants of the 12 tribes of Israel. Okay, so Judah is one of the 12 tribes. But this area was actually conquered earlier by the Assyrians, and they had a similar kind of idea that the Assyrians also tried to kind of eradicate the Israelites here by assimilation. So they moved some of the Israelites to Assyria, and they moved a bunch of the Assyrians. They moved down here, and they kind of did mix. And so when the Jews came back from Babylon, they, the Jews that have gone through the exile, they consider themselves the real Jews now, because they thought the exile experience had purified them and taught them how to really live the Torah. And they came back with the form of Judaism pretty much that we have today, and the strict observance of the law of Moses and all these ideas. So when they came back and started rebuilding the temple, actually some Sumerian, who were the ancestors of the Israelites, up here in the north of Judea, they still worship Yahweh, and they had actually had places where they worship Yahweh in the mountains. They had shrines up there, and they came down with money and said, "We want to help rebuild the temple." But the Jews who returned from exile said, "No, you can't help us rebuild the temple because you're not pure Jews like we are. You're not pure Israelites. You would actually defile it." So up back they went, and ever since then, the Judeans and the Jews and the Samaritans and the Samaritans did not like each other. They were, like family rivals, so to speak, but they would never call each other family. So we see when Jesus talks to Samaritans, and there's a scene where he talks to a Samaritan woman, which is actually a double no-no, because Jewish men weren't supposed to talk to women who weren't in their family or somehow associated with them in some official way. We see that as really Jesus including the excluded, right? Jesus kind of refusing to live by these prejudices that had crept into his native faith. So he was Jewish, right? Jew from Galilee. So if you understand those three areas there in Roman Palestine. So up in Galilee, the ruler was this guy called Herod Antipas. Now the Herods were half Jews and half Jewish and half Roman, and they were raised in Rome. And then the Romans put them in power over these provinces. And they said to the Jews, "Look, we have a Jewish king for you. You can have your own king. He's Jewish." But they really weren't Jewish. They were really Roman trained and raised, and they did Rome's bidding pretty much. In Judea, they had another one of the Herods, Herod Archelaus, but he was so bad and he was so oppressive to the Jews in Judea that they actually petitioned the Roman emperor, to give them a direct governor from Rome. They said, "We don't want this Herod king. We don't care if he's half Jewish. We'd rather just have a Roman governor. This guy's so bad." And so they got Pontius Pilate. Maybe not the best guy. He was famous for executing political dissidents. So that happened about 6 AD. So Jesus would have been a baby during that time. Remember, historians think maybe the year 3 would be a more accurate date for the birth of Jesus than 0. Okay, other groups. Well, one other group we had was the Sadducees. Now, the Sadducees were the priests in the Jerusalem temple. And the Jerusalem temple was the center of Jewish life, religious life, cultural life, even economic life, beginning with King Solomon in around the year 900. All right, and then when they went to exile in 587 BC, when the Babylonians sacked the city, the temple was destroyed. When they came back, they built another temple. So people call this Second Temple Judaism. All right, so the Sadducees were the priests in that temple, which were, in the days of Solomon and the other Jewish kings before the exile. These guys were really the center of religious life. You would bring your sacrifices to the temple, and the priests would offer them to God for you. All right. Now, in Jesus' time, these people weren't that respected, though. Why? Because, again, they were Roman imports. They were supposed to be relatives of Moses' brother Aaron, right? And their name was family name was Cohen. That was what the Jewish tradition said. Not all the Sadducees under the Romans were. They were, again, kind of handpicked by the Romans, people who were ready to play with the Romans, work with them, and most significantly, give them a portion of the money that people gave to make sacrifices to God. So there's a whole very ritualized form of religion that was going on during Jesus' time with the temple worship and sacrifices. We'll find out Jesus is actually quite critical of this. He thinks, just like a lot of the Old Testament prophets did, that people were spending a lot of time and money on these rituals, but they weren't understanding the meaning of the rituals, so it wasn't doing them any good. They weren't living out the meaning of it. Another major group of religious leaders in Judea in the time of Jesus was the Sanhedrin. Now, the Sanhedrin was the traditional Jewish council of elders. And again, they had this before the exile. When they came back, it was reformed. But by the time they're under Roman rule here, in the time of Jesus, these guys, again, are kind of just handpicked by the Romans. And again, they're people that are willing to cooperate with the Romans. And the average Jew sees through this and doesn't really respect them either. So these two were kind of seen as fakes, right? So they kind of gave them the old system and said, oh, look, here, you have your traditional leadership with the Sadducees and the temple priests, and then the Sanhedrin, the council of elders. Well, guess what? Everybody was like, we know they're basically puppets for the Romans. The average Jew resented these people, did not think they were their true leaders. There was a group of religious leaders, though, that was well respected by the average Jew in the time of Jesus, and they were called the Pharisees. Now, the Pharisees came to be in the time of the exile. When the Jews were exiled into Babylon, they had no temple anymore, right? And they had no Sanhedrin, they had no city, or no council of elders, right, to help rule it. They were alone in Babylon, so to speak. And so they started to form these groups of people who would study the law of Moses. And they formed the law of Moses into some of the parts that we see in the Old Testament today. And teachers called Pharisees would study the law and teach from it. So you see in the Gospels, when people call Jesus teacher, that's the title that they would use for Pharisees. So these people, because they actually studied the ancient traditions of the Israelites and tried to live by them to some degree, these people actually were respected, right? So when the Jews came back from the exile, this Pharisee tradition, or this rabbinical tradition, right? Rabbi or teacher was another name they had for this group, was very well respected, and it continued. And so this is the form of Judaism that we still have today, where you have these Jewish rabbis who are the leaders, and then the people come together, not at the Jerusalem temple, but in groups called synagogues, where they would meet on the Sabbath, which is Saturday, and study the Torah. So this word Pharisee was not originally a bad word. It was actually, during the time of Jesus, the title for the respected group of religious leaders who the Jewish people actually found to be authentic, unlike the other two Roman puppets here, the Sadducees and the Sanhedrin. Some fringe groups were the Essenes and the Zealots. The Essenes were these devout Jews who believed that the Jerusalem temple, right, the center for Jewish worship and religious ritual, had been defiled and corrupted by the Roman occupation. So they thought the way that the Romans were interfering with the temple, it wasn't really the temple anymore. So they went out and lived in caves in the desert, where they would serve a spiritual priesthood 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Okay, the priest in the temple often would only serve for a certain period of time a year. But these guys went full out priesthood. They lived a pretty ascetic life, and they were pretty, for lack of a better word, hardcore. Now, the Essenes were not, again, they just lived out here in the desert. They themselves were not zealots, but they were often associated with the zealots, and there might have been some mixing. You know, like the zealots might have come out and visited them, and maybe even stayed with them for a while, possibly sheltered them at times when they needed it. Again, I don't have any proof of that, but of exact cases of that. But there is some philosophical and political alignment with their ideas that they just both want the Romans out. Okay, but the Essenes are up here praying about it. The Zealots were people who, and here's their famous long swords called the Sicarii. They would actually try to launch armed rebellions against the Romans. So one of the apostles, Simon the Zealot, right? You would call these people today freedom fighters if you were on their sides, or terrorists if you were not in keeping with their beliefs and did not think that their attempts at a violent overthrow of the Romans was justified. So again, those are a couple of fringe groups that were associated with Judaism and the Jewish faith. What about just like the majority of Jews in the Roman Empire? What about the average Jew, so to speak, the average Yusuf? All right. Well, they were basically poor. The Romans really liked the Jews because they were hardworking and they were trustworthy. They had the law of Moses, so they lived by that, and therefore they were moral. You know, they could trust them. They didn't need to police them. They wouldn't lie. They wouldn't steal. Right? They had this cultural mores, right? And so in that way, they kind of, liked them and thought they were a good addition to the Roman Empire. However, like other people they conquered, they just taxed the heck out of them, right? So the average Jew, take Jesus's father, earthly father, Saint Joseph. He was, according to scripture, a tekton, right, which actually means skilled worker. So, of course, when the faith moved to Europe, they said, oh, well, that's a carpenter, because in Europe they build things with trees. However, in Palestine in the first century, they did not build too many buildings out of wood. There wasn't a lot of wood around there. What they built was stone. So more likely, St. Joseph, the worker, was a stonemason, right? So it's a skilled labor. It seems like a good job, like you make a lot of money, but what the Romans would do was just tax you heavily. They would take almost everything you had. And then that would force you to survive on Roman patronage. The rich Roman families would give you a handout so you could feed your family and stay alive. Now, that of course was dependent on you doing what they wanted. So this was a great system for oppressing people uh, and controlling them that the Romans had. Tax the heck out of them so they're poor, right? And dependent on you, right? Then the rich Roman families can give them money, right? Uh, if they behave the way they want. So you can see why so many Jews in the time of Jesus very much resented Roman rule, and they very much wanted the Romans to go away. However, we'll look and see why armed rebellion was not something that most of them were willing to participate in. All right, we'll just stop it here, and we'll come back with the next video talking about what Jesus preached, which was the kingdom of heaven or the kingdom of God.